Hi friends, welcome back. Today I'll bring you a new horror stories, but before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you like today's stories. Only a few ads in the first 10 minutes and after that, all completely free. So without further ado, dim the light, pull up your blanket, and let's begin the stories.
There was an old rule my grandfather had about the barn. He said the doors should never stay open after dark, not even for a minute. I grew up on that farm, so those kinds of rules never felt strange to me. They were just part of how things were done. We had a lot of rules like that. No lights in the chicken shed past 9. No walking near the silos after sunset. Always checked the grain bin before closing it for the night. At the time, I thought they were just old habits from a man who'd lived his whole life with animals and machinery. When he passed away, I took over the property. It was quiet and isolated. The closest neighbor was half a mile down a dirt road. Most nights, it was peaceful in a way that made you forget time existed. You could hear frogs near the pond, the wind through the dry stalks, and sometimes the cows shifting around in the dark. I followed his routines exactly at first, mostly out of respect. I kept the doors closed, the lights low, and the hours predictable. But after a few months, I started to think about how strict he had been, and it started to bother me a little. It happened one night late in October. I had been in the main house finishing paperwork when I realized I'd forgotten to latch the west barn door. The wind was getting stronger, and I could hear the faint banging of loose wood outside. I looked at the clock, and it was almost 11. I thought about leaving it for morning, but that habit of checking things was too deep. So I grabbed my flashlight and coat and stepped out. The air felt heavy and wet, even though it hadn't rained. The yard light barely reached past the well, so everything beyond that was a blur of dark shapes. The barn stood about 100 yards away, long and low, with its roof sagging slightly near the center. As I walked, I could hear the crunch of gravel under my boots and that soft whining sound the wind makes when it passes through the slats of old wood. It was quiet otherwise, no animal sounds at all. I remember thinking that was strange. Usually at least one of the cows would be restless or one of the cats would dart out from under the tractors. But that night, it was silent. I kept the flashlight aimed at the ground, mostly so I wouldn't blind myself if something reflected back. When I got closer, I noticed the barn door wasn't swinging like I expected. It was open, but perfectly still. It should have been moving in the wind, but it wasn't. I stopped a few steps away. I could smell the hay and dust and that faint metallic scent that comes from the feed bins. My flashlight beam hit the edge of the door, and I saw deep scratch marks on the inside of the wood, like something had clawed at it. The marks were fresh, pale against the darker surface. I crouched to look closer and saw bits of dirt packed into the grooves, like whatever made them had come from outside. When I finally went in, the air felt different, heavy and warmer, almost humid. The flashlight beam showed floating bits of hay dust hanging thick in the air. I walked down the center aisle, my boots soft on the straw, and looked into each stall. Everything was empty. The cows were out in the pasture, and the equipment hadn't been moved. Still, something felt off. The silence had a kind of weight to it that made me slow down without realizing it. Halfway down, I heard something from the back wall. It wasn't loud, more like a slow, dragging sound, like fabric being pulled along the floor. I turned the light toward it, but the beam hit the wooden boards and stopped there. I took a few steps closer, feeling each one like it might be too loud. The dragging stopped. Then there was nothing. No sound at all. Just the wind outside pushing faintly against the roof. I thought it might be a tarp or an old blanket caught on something. But when I got to the end, there was nothing there. Just the back wall and the small door that led to the feed room. That door was open a few inches. It used to stick, so it rarely stayed open by itself. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether to push it closed or check inside first. The smell coming from that little room wasn't right. It wasn't rot or manure. It smelled faintly like old metal, like coins after rain. I reached for the handle, and it moved slightly before I touched it. Not much, just enough to make me freeze. It was like someone on the other side had nudged it from within. I waited, hand still out, but the door didn't move again. After a moment, I pushed it open slowly. The flashlight beam hit the old sacks of feed, some overturned buckets, and the corner where my grandfather used to store broken tools. Nothing moved, but the air inside that little room was warmer than the rest of the barn, almost like it was being heated from the ground. That was when I heard it again, a faint dragging sound, but this time from above. My light caught on the ceiling beams. The dust was falling in a slow drift from between them, like something had brushed past up there. I could just make out shapes of cobwebs and rafters. Then I noticed a small patch where the dust was still shifting, almost pulsing, like something had recently crawled across it. I kept the light on that spot above me for a long time. Dust kept falling in slow spirals, and every few seconds I thought I saw movement, but it always stopped before I could focus. The silence was thick, almost pressing against my ears. I backed out of the feed room, careful not to make noise, even though I wasn't sure why I was doing that. I moved slow until I was standing in the middle of the barn again. The air still had that heavy warmth to it, and I could hear the faint sound of the wind outside again. I decided I'd just close the door and lock it for the night. Whatever it was could wait until morning. I turned and started toward the main doors. That's when I realized something about the floor didn't look right. The straw near the front of the barn was flattened, like something heavy had been dragged through it toward the door. I followed it with my light, expecting to see maybe a feed sack or a raccoon that had gotten in. But the trail was wide, like the width of a person lying flat. It led to the center doors, the same doors I'd come through. But now one of them was shut. I hadn't touched it. I stood there looking at it for a good minute, waiting to hear the wind move it or something explain it. It stayed still. I stepped closer and noticed the metal latch had been slid halfway into place. That meant it hadn't just swung on its own. Something or someone had started to lock it from inside. I reached for it, and when my hand brushed the cold metal, I felt that same vibration through the wood that I'd felt earlier. A faint thud somewhere deeper in the barn, followed by a softer sound, like a foot shifting on straw. I turned around slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the stalls again. The beam moved over, the feeding troughs, the old tools, the hanging ropes. Nothing moved. Still, I could feel it. That sense of being watched, not from far away, but from somewhere close enough to hear me breathe. I backed toward the door again, keeping my light moving. I told myself it had to be an animal. Maybe one of the stray dogs that came around sometimes, or a possum stuck in the rafters. But I couldn't make myself believe that. The smell was still there, faint but sharp, and the air hadn't cooled even though I'd opened the door wider. I stepped outside finally, feeling the night air hit me, colder than I remembered it being just a few minutes before. When I turned to pull the door shut, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The other door, the one that had stayed open the whole time, had fresh marks on the inside, lower than the first ones I'd seen. Deep grooves, curved slightly, with little bits of what looked like hay stuck in them. They hadn't been there earlier when I first checked. I stared at them for a while, then shut both doors tight and dropped the latch. I walked back toward the house without looking behind me. The yard light flickered once, and that's when I realized the night was completely still again. No crickets, no frogs, not even the wind. Just the crunch of gravel under my boots and the sound of my own breath. When I got inside, I checked every window and made sure the back door was locked. I turned off the kitchen light and sat by the window watching the barn through the glass. It stayed dark. No movement. No light. But after about an hour, just when I started to think I'd imagined most of it, I saw a faint line of light appear along the barn's lower boards, like something inside was moving with a small lamp or lantern. It wasn't steady. It swayed back and forth slowly, like someone pacing. I watched it for nearly 10 minutes before it faded again. The next morning, I went out early. The barn was just as I'd left it, except for one thing. The latch was still down, but the doors were slightly open, just enough for a few inches of light to spill through. Inside, the floor looked like it had been swept in wide, uneven strokes, like something had dragged across it in the night and pushed the straw aside. I looked up at the rafters where I'd seen the dust fall, and there was nothing there except a small, dark stain along one of the beams. That night, I nailed both barn doors shut. I didn't care what my grandfather's rules had been anymore. I stopped keeping animals after that year. The place still stands, but no one's used it since. When the wind picks up, I sometimes hear the old boards shifting and that same soft, dragging sound underneath it. It's been years, but every time I hear it, I remember the warmth of that air and how the dust seemed to move like it was breathing. Story 2. There used to be a farm about 3 miles from where I grew up that everyone in town avoided after sundown. The owners had moved away years ago, and no one ever bought the property. People said the soil was bad, that the animals would die for no clear reason, but nobody ever proved anything. I never paid much attention to those stories until my cousin asked me to help him clear out one of the old barns. He had plans to take the lumber for a new shed on his land, and he didn't want to go alone. We went out there on a Sunday morning in late spring. The road was rough, and the grass had grown over most of the path leading up to the house. It didn't look haunted or anything, just abandoned. The farmhouse leaned to one side, and the windows were clouded from dust and rain. The barn sat farther back, half sunk into the soft ground, the doors warped from years of weather. There were still rusted tools scattered in the dirt, and a few pieces of equipment half buried under weeds. The first few hours went fine. We cleared debris, stacked the wood, and joked about how much work we'd saved by not doing this alone. The air was still and warm, and it smelled like old hay and mud. Every so often, I'd hear something small move inside the walls, probably mice or birds. That kind of noise was normal for places like that. Around midday, I went to get more nails from the truck, when I noticed something odd. The ground around the back of the barn looked freshly disturbed, like something had been dug up recently. At first, I thought it might have been an animal. There were clawed holes, uneven and deep, but too wide for a dog or raccoon. I leaned down to look closer. The soil was darker, almost black, and there were bits of straw mixed in. It looked like someone had buried something there and then pulled it back out. My cousin came around and asked if I'd found anything, and I told him it was nothing. We went back to work. By late afternoon, the lights started to fade, and the wind picked up a little. The old barn doors kept moving with each gust, creaking loud enough to echo as the place started to feel different then. It's hard to explain exactly what changed, but the air seemed heavier, like it held more weight. Every sound carried farther, and there was this strange quiet between the wind gusts, like the whole field was holding its breath. I went back inside to grab the crowbar we'd left by the wall. The interior looked darker than it should have, even though the doors were open. My eyes adjusted, and I noticed something I hadn't before. There were shapes in the dirt floor, faint outlines that looked like prints, but not from boots or hooves. They were too long and narrow, almost like handprints, but stretched. They led from the far wall toward the center of the barn and stopped right where we had been stacking the wood. I remember feeling my throat tighten a little, but I didn't say anything. I just picked up the crowbar and pretended not to notice. When I turned to leave, I heard something behind me shift, slow and dry, like straw being moved by a steady hand. I looked back, but the floor was still. The prints were still visible, but they looked fresher now, sharper around the edges. I stepped back toward the door, moving slower than I meant to. The sound came again from the same direction, but closer. It wasn't fast or loud, just steady, like something dragging its palm across the dirt. My cousin called from outside, asking if I was done, and the noise stopped right then. Everything went silent again. I told him I was coming and stepped out quickly, closing the door behind me without meaning to. We loaded the rest of the boards onto the truck as fast as we could. The sun was low now, almost gone, and the air had that strange electric feeling right before dark. I looked back once at the barn, and I swear I saw something move through the gap between the doors. Just a flicker of shape, low to the ground, sliding past. My cousin didn't notice, or maybe he did and didn't want to talk about it. When we started driving away, he mentioned something about how quiet the engine sounded, even though it was running fine. I realized then that I couldn't hear the wind anymore, or the crickets, or anything else. Just the tires rolling over gravel and that strange hum that seemed to come from nowhere. I didn't look back again until we were halfway down the road. The barn was barely visible by then, just a shadow against the trees, but the doors that had been closed were now wide open again, swinging slowly even though there was no wind. I didn't go back there for almost 2 weeks after that. My cousin tried calling me about hauling the rest of the wood, but I ignored him. He finally went back alone one morning, saying he'd finished the job himself. That same night, around midnight, I heard a truck pull up outside my house. When I looked out, it was him. He didn't get out right away, just sat there with the engine running. When I went out to the porch, he rolled down the window halfway. He looked pale, and his clothes were covered in dirt and hay. He said he was done with that place. That was all he told me. I didn't ask questions, but I could tell something had scared him bad. After he drove off, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I drove out there just to see what he'd left behind. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. The road looked even worse than before. The ruts were deeper, and the weeds seemed higher, like the place had aged faster than it should have. The house looked the same, but the barn was worse. One of the doors was missing, and the other was hanging by a single hinge. The wood we'd stacked was scattered across the yard like someone had thrown it. The tire marks from my cousin's truck led halfway around the barn, then stopped abruptly, like he'd turned back too quickly. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't rot or mold, just something stale and dry, like old dirt mixed with iron. The air was thick and warm, the kind of warmth that doesn't come from sunlight. The prints were still there, but there were more now, crossing over each other in loops and curves, like something had been pacing or crawling back and forth through the night. I followed them without thinking. They led toward the far corner of the barn, where the boards on the wall had warped and pulled away from the frame. There was a small gap there, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. The dirt around it was darker, damp, even though the rest of the ground was dry. I crouched down to look closer, shining my flashlight inside. The light didn't go far. It just hit more dirt and what looked like a short tunnel sloping downward under the wall. The smell got stronger when I leaned closer. That metallic scent, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I thought I saw something move down there, just a small shift in the shadows. The dirt near the opening trembled a little, like something was breathing under it. I stepped back quickly, bumping into a hanging chain that clinked softly against the wall. That small sound was enough to break the stillness. The dirt near the tunnel shifted again, a slow, deliberate movement, and a faint scraping noise came from deep inside. I turned around and walked straight out. I didn't run, but my legs felt stiff, like they wanted to. When I reached the truck, I looked back once. The air near the barn doors looked distorted, like heat rising off pavement, even though the wind had picked up and the day was cool. I got in and left without checking anything else. That night, my cousin called again. He said he'd been having dreams about the barn. He didn't describe them, just said he kept seeing the dirt floor and something moving beneath it. He asked if I'd noticed anything when I went back. I told him no, even though I could still smell that iron scent in my nose when he said it. The next few weeks were quiet. He stopped answering his phone, and his truck was gone from his driveway. His wife said he'd gone to visit a friend out of state, but no one heard from him after that. I went back to the farm one last time out of some kind of guilt, maybe hoping I'd see a sign that he'd been there. But when I got to the property, the barn was gone. Not collapsed or burned, just gone. The ground was bare, flat, except for one long hollow in the dirt that looked like something had sunk into it. The field around it was completely silent, no wind, no birds, no insects. The air was warm again, even though it was evening. I walked as far as the hollow and stopped. The soil looked fresh, darker than before, like it had been turned from underneath. I stood there until the light started to fade, and I thought I heard something faint, just under the ground. A slow scrape, like fingers brushing through dry straw. I left and didn't look back. The road behind me looked longer than it should have, the way it does when you're trying to leave somewhere you're not supposed to be. I still think about that smell sometimes when I drive past open fields at night. It hits me all at once, that metallic taste in the air, and for a second I think about stopping. But I never do. Story 3. The well on my uncle's farm had been sealed for as long as I could remember. It sat behind the main barn, covered with a circular iron grate, and chained at both ends. He said it wasn't safe, that the wood framing inside had collapsed years ago. But there was something about that part of the property that always felt wrong, even during the day. The grass around it grew faster than anywhere else, but it turned pale yellow within days, no matter how much rain we got. When my uncle passed away, I stayed on the farm for a few weeks to help sort through his things. It was quiet there. Too quiet for a place surrounded by fields and livestock. Most of the cows had been sold off already, and the few that were left kept their distance from the back barn. I started noticing that they never wandered near the well, even though the grass around it was thick and green. I figured it was just habit. They must have sensed the chain, or maybe heard the echo from the grate. Animals know when something isn't right. One evening, I was cleaning tools behind the barn when I noticed the chain around the well had been moved. It wasn't undone, just shifted a few inches to one side. I thought maybe the wind had caught it somehow, but the links were heavy, thick with rust, and there hadn't been any strong wind all day. I set it back into place and told myself it was nothing. But after that, I kept glancing at it every time I walked past, like I expected it to move again. A few nights later, the sound started. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping coming from somewhere deep underground. I only heard it when I was in the back half of the barn, or near the well. It would start just after dark and stop around midnight. I tried to ignore it, but when you live alone on a farm that quiet, even small noises get inside your head. The tapping became part of my routine. I'd go out to check, find nothing, and come back inside pretending I hadn't heard it. One night I decided to see if it was just something loose inside the well. I brought my flashlight and knelt down beside the grate. The metal was cold enough to sting my fingers. When I aimed the light through the bars, all I could see was a faint shimmer on the water below. I dropped a small rock and waited for the splash, but I never heard one. The rock just seemed to vanish. That was the first time I noticed there was no echo. Even when I spoke softly near the opening, the sound didn't come back up. It was like the space below swallowed everything. That bothered me enough that I went back inside and tried to forget about it. But the tapping started again, louder this time. I could hear it through the wall, steady and slow, like someone knocking from beneath the floor. I walked back out with the flashlight, this time staying a few feet away from the well. The sound stopped as soon as I stepped outside. The air was colder now, the kind of still cold that makes your breath hang in front of you. I waited, listening. Nothing. Then, just as I turned to go, I heard it again, but not from below. It came from under the barn itself. I froze for a long time, flashlight shaking in my hand. The barn sat on concrete blocks, maybe 2 feet off the ground in some places. The sound was coming from directly under it, moving slowly toward me. It was still that same tapping, steady and dull, like knuckles on wood. I crouched down, angling the light under the boards, but all I saw was dirt and a few scattered tools. The sound stopped again. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again, faint through the walls, tapping once every few seconds like it was counting something. By morning, I felt sick and tired enough to consider leaving for good. But something in me wanted to check one last time. Maybe I thought I could finally prove it was just pipes or settling wood. When I went back out that morning, the first thing I saw was the chain around the well. It was undone, both ends unhooked and lying flat on the ground. The grate had been shifted a few inches, tilted enough that I could see a gap along one side. The dirt around it looked wet, darker than before, as if something had been moved from underneath. I remember kneeling beside it again, shining the flashlight into the gap. The water below was still dark, but I could see ripples spreading outward like something had disturbed the surface. I tried to tell myself it was just wind or a falling branch, but the air was completely still. Then I heard it, just once, a single tap right beneath the grate. And after that single tap, I stood frozen beside the well for what felt like several minutes. Nothing else happened. But the quiet was so thick that even the smallest sound seemed sharp. The ripples on the surface below began to fade, but the water didn't settle. It looked like it was moving on its own, swirling in slow, uneven circles. I backed away carefully, keeping my light on it until I reached the barn door. The moment I stepped inside, the light beam flickered and went out completely. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust. The barn smelled damp, like soil after rain, even though it hadn't rained in days. I stood there in the dark, trying to listen for the tapping again. Instead, I heard something different. A faint scraping sound, not from below this time, but from inside the barn walls. It moved in a slow, dragging rhythm, like something pulling itself across the wooden planks. The walls creaked lightly each time it shifted. I stood still, hardly breathing, trying to figure out which direction it was coming from. The sound made its way toward the back corner, near the stalls that hadn't been used in years. I thought about leaving right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I fumbled for the light switch near the door. The bulb blinked on and off twice before finally staying lit, casting a weak yellow glow across the room. The scraping stopped immediately. Everything inside looked normal. Dusty tools, old ropes, some stacked hay. But the smell was stronger now, that same damp, earthy scent mixed with something metallic underneath. I walked slowly toward the back, glancing at the floor to make sure it was solid. When I reached the last stall, I saw that the wooden boards along the back wall were darker than the rest, soaked with something that had run down from behind them. I leaned closer and saw the faint shimmer of moisture. The boards were wet, but there hadn't been any leaks. I touched one of the boards with my fingertips, and it was cold, unnaturally cold, like metal left outside in winter. When I pulled my hand back, the tip of my finger came away smeared with something gray and thin, like muddy water. I stared at it for a moment before wiping it on my jeans. That was when I heard the sound again, directly behind the wall. A single knock. Not fast, not loud. Just one. The sound vibrated through the wood, and I felt it under my palm. I took a step back, staring at the boards. Another knock came, this time lower down, closer to the floor. It reminded me of the way someone might test a door from the other side. The air grew colder the longer I stood there. I could see my breath now, a faint mist in the dim yellow light. Then, from the far corner of the barn, near the base of the wall, I saw movement. The dirt there began to shift, slowly pushing upward as though something underneath was trying to surface. A small patch bulged up, cracked slightly, and settled again. I didn't wait to see more. I turned, ran for the door, and didn't stop until I was halfway across the yard. The chain that had been lying loose beside the well was gone. Only one end remained, half buried in the dirt. The grate itself was back in place, though not quite level, like something had pulled it down from underneath. I locked the house that night, every door and window. The sound of the tapping returned just before midnight, but it was faint, coming from somewhere farther away, like it had moved beyond the well. I could feel it through the floorboards. A dull, slow rhythm that seemed to drift from one end of the house to the other. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the kitchen, listening, counting each tap until it stopped sometime before dawn. The next morning, I packed my truck and left. I didn't even finish sorting my uncle's things. I drove to town and stayed in a motel for 2 nights before deciding not to go back. A few weeks later, one of the neighbors called to say the well behind the barn had caved in after a storm. The ground around it had sunk in a wide circle, leaving a hole almost 6 feet deep. They planned to fill it, but when they poured gravel inside, it never filled up. It just kept sinking. No one lives on that property now. The barn is still there, and so is what's left of the well. When the wind is low, people say they hear a dull sound from under the ground, like someone knocking through layers of earth. I don't know if that's true. I haven't gone back to find out. But sometimes, when it's quiet at night, I hear that same slow rhythm in the walls of my own house, like it followed me home. Story 4. There was a small dairy farm my parents owned when I was younger. It sat in a quiet valley surrounded by low hills and patches of forest. We didn't have much, just a few cows, chickens, and a faded red barn that leaned slightly on its left side. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. After my parents passed, I moved back to the farm to take care of it. Most of the buildings were still standing. Though the barn had seen better days, the roof had a hole near the ridge, and one of the doors dragged against the ground when you tried to close it. I spent the first few weeks cleaning up. The cowshed still smelled like the old days. A mix of hay, mud, and something sour that never really went away. I started milking again, small batches, just to keep a rhythm. The first few mornings were calm. The air was cold, and I could hear the wind moving through the gaps in the boards. But then I started noticing little things that didn't make sense. It began with the feed. I'd fill the troughs at night, measure them carefully like I always did. By morning, the feed would be gone. Every bit of it, but the cows didn't look full. They barely touched their hay. I thought maybe rodents had gotten in, but there weren't any droppings or holes. Then I started finding the barn door open in the morning, just wide enough for a person to slip through. I knew I had locked it. The chain on the latch hung loose like someone had unhooked it carefully, and then hooked it back wrong. One night I stayed up late to see if it would happen again. Around 2 in the morning, I went out with a lantern. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own heartbeat. The cows were quiet, standing in their stalls, facing the same direction. Every one of them stared toward the far wall. I followed their gaze and saw that the feed room door was cracked open, just slightly. It hadn't been like that when I locked up. I took a step closer, and one of the cows shifted, making a low, uneasy sound. The smell in that corner was strange. It wasn't manure or rot, but something sharp, almost metallic. I reached for the door, and before I could touch it, the lantern flickered and went out. The barn dropped into pitch-black silence. I froze, listening. I could hear something soft moving on the other side of the door. Not footsteps. Something slower, like fabric dragging across the floor. I backed away slowly, keeping my hands out in front of me until I felt the rough edge of a stall post. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to stop. When it finally did, I relit the lantern. The light came back shaky and weak, but the door was closed again. I left it alone and went back to the house, locking everything behind me. The next morning, I found the feed room door open wide. Inside, the bags had been torn open, not ripped like by claws, but sliced clean down the middle. The feed was scattered across the floor in a perfect circle, like someone had measured it. There were no footprints, just a smooth surface where something heavy had been dragged in a wide loop. I didn't tell anyone about it. I just swept it up and decided I'd start keeping the feed somewhere else. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of the cows again. They weren't lowing or panicking. They were making a steady, rhythmic noise like short grunts spaced evenly apart. It almost sounded like breathing. I got up, pulled on my boots, and went outside. The barn light was off, but the doors were slightly open again. I stood at the threshold and listened. The breathing sound was louder inside, echoing softly against the walls. It wasn't coming from the cows this time. I turned the lantern toward the stalls and saw the cows all facing the same way again, perfectly still. Their eyes reflected the light, wide and glassy. Behind them in the dark end of the barn, something was moving. It was slow, almost careful, brushing against the floor like someone crawling. The sound of that movement filled the space between the cows' breaths, steady and deliberate. I felt a tightness in my chest then. My hand shook so badly the lantern rattled. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a stray dog that had gotten in. But when I tried to move closer, every cow in the barn shifted at once. Their hooves stomped once, then silence again. Whatever was in the corner stopped moving too. The air felt thicker, like it was holding a weight over everything. I turned slowly, set the lantern on a post, and reached for the chain on the barn door. I didn't run. I didn't even breathe loud. I hooked the chain, stepped outside, and shut the door gently behind me. The moment it latched, I heard one soft sound from inside, like a long exhale, low and wet, pressed against the wood. I didn't look back. I didn't go inside the barn for the next 2 days. I left the cows to feed on what I tossed from outside the door, and pretended the rest didn't matter. But the smell started getting worse. It wasn't manure or feed. It was that same metallic scent again, mixed with something damp and sour. By the third day, it was seeping into the house. Every window I opened just carried it back inside. I knew I had to go check, even though every part of me didn't want to. That evening, I waited until the light was almost gone before I walked out. The barn looked darker than usual, like the roof itself was pressing down, lower. The chain on the door was unhooked again, hanging loose against the wood. I stood there for a while, just staring at it, trying to remember if I might have forgotten to lock it myself. I hadn't. The metal felt warm when I touched it, as if it had been handled recently. Inside, the air was heavy, humid, and thick. The lantern light barely cut through the darkness. The cows were quiet again, all facing the same corner where the feed room was. The floor looked different, too, cleaner, like someone had swept it. The feed that I'd moved to the other storage area was gone. The sacks that had been full the night before were empty, torn apart again, that same perfect circular shape left in the dust. I stepped farther in, slow enough that I could hear the sound of the straw under my boots. That's when I realized it wasn't completely silent. There was a faint sound coming from somewhere deep inside the barn, steady and soft, like breathing again. It didn't sound human, but it wasn't quite animal either. The rhythm of it changed every few seconds, like it was adjusting to mine. I stopped walking. The sound stopped. Then, after a few seconds, it started again, closer this time. It came from the feed room. The lantern flickered again, just once, but enough to make every shape around me shift for a split second. The cows' heads moved in unison, following something along the ground. I didn't see what they were looking at, but their eyes followed a slow path from one stall to the next, as if something was crawling past them. The air got colder. I could see the vapor of my breath mixing with the lantern glow. The breathing sound moved again, right behind the wall now, maybe 2 feet away. It pressed softly against the wood, like it was feeling for a way through. The boards creaked just enough to show strain, a long, stretching sound that echoed up into the rafters. I turned to leave, keeping the lantern raised in front of me when I saw something that made me stop. One of the cows at the end of the row was standing wrong. Its head was turned all the way toward the back wall, but its body hadn't moved. Its neck looked too long, too tense, and I could hear a low clicking sound coming from its throat. The others stayed still, not reacting at all. I took a step closer, but I didn't get near enough to touch it. The cow's head twitched once, then dropped back into place like it had gone limp. The clicking stopped. That's when the breathing on the other side of the wall stopped too. Everything went still again, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, like something was waiting. I backed up slowly, one step at a time, until I reached the door. My hand shook when I hooked the chain again, but I forced it into place and pulled the door shut tight. The latch clicked louder than usual. When I got back to the house, I left every light on. I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m, I heard a heavy sound outside, like something brushing against the siding of the house. It circled once, slow, dragging against the walls as it moved. Then it stopped under the window by my bed. I didn't move or look out. I just listened. There was a single exhale, long and steady, and then nothing. At sunrise, I went out and found the barn door wide open again. The chain was broken this time, split clean in half. Inside, the cows were gone. The stalls were empty except for wet patches of straw and deep marks on the floor, like something had been dragged out toward the pasture. I followed them only halfway before I turned back. The trail led toward the tree line, and the grass there was flattened in wide arcs. I sold the farm a month later. The new owners only lasted one season before they left. They said the cows kept disappearing at night, and sometimes they'd wake up to find the barn doors open, no matter how tightly they locked them. The last thing I heard before I moved away was that no one was willing to buy the place anymore. They said the barn still smells faintly like metal, even though there's nothing left inside. Story 5. There's a cattle farm a few towns over that I worked on for a summer about 10 years ago. It was run by a quiet couple in their 50s, the kind of people who kept to themselves but always had work for anyone willing to put in the hours. The place was big. 2 barns, a small slaughter shed, and a fenced pasture that stretched almost to the edge of the woods. I lived in a small cabin behind the second barn, close enough to hear the animals at night. For the first few weeks, everything felt normal. Long days, sore hands, and early mornings. The kind of routine work that made time move slow but steady. The only thing that felt off was how empty the second barn always seemed. They told me it hadn't been used in years. The doors were chained, and there was a faded sign nailed to one side that read, "Keep closed." I didn't think much of it. Every farm had corners full of forgotten things. Then, sometime in July, the couple left for a few days to visit family. They told me to feed the animals, keep the lights on at night, and stay out of the second barn. That last part they said clearly, both of them looking at me longer than felt normal. I promised I'd leave it alone. The first night went fine. The wind was calm, and the air smelled like grass and diesel. I walked the fence line before bed, checked the locks, and went back to the cabin. But around midnight, I woke up to the sound of cows. Not their usual low calls. These were sharper, like short bursts of panic, that stopped and started in uneven intervals. I threw on my jacket and went outside. The first barn light was flickering, but the second barn, the one that was supposed to stay locked, had a dim glow inside. A thin yellow light leaking through the cracks between the boards. I called out once, just a reflex, but no one answered. The cows were restless, pressing against the fence, eyes reflecting in the dark like small lanterns. I walked toward the barn slowly, boots crunching over gravel. The closer I got, the more I realized the light inside wasn't electric. It flickered unevenly, like a flame. I stopped a few feet from the door and listened. There was a sound coming from inside, something heavy, dragging along the floor, followed by a faint, wet slap. The smell hit next, thick and coppery, like iron left out in the rain. It made the back of my throat tighten. I tried to tell myself it was a raccoon or maybe a wild dog that got in. I leaned closer, and that's when I noticed the chain on the door was gone. Not broken, just gone. The hooks were still in place, but the chain had been completely removed. I took a step back, and the dragging sound stopped. Then a new sound started. Slow, rhythmic knocking from somewhere deeper inside. It wasn't on the door or the walls. It came from under the floor, like something striking the wooden beams from below. The knocks were spaced apart, steady, almost deliberate. I remember counting them under my breath. 7 knocks, then silence. I backed away, walked around the barn once, and saw something strange near the foundation. The ground looked torn up in a straight line leading from the edge of the barn toward the tree line. The dirt was churned, and I could see the faint impression of something long and smooth, like a rope or a hose had been dragged through it. But it went too deep, cutting several inches into the soil. I followed it with my flashlight until it disappeared under a fallen log. When I turned back toward the barn, the light inside had gone out. The cows had gone quiet too. The only sound was the faint clicking of insects in the grass and the wind pushing against the fence. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat there until the sun came up. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I went to check the barn again in daylight. The chain was back in place. I swear it was the same one, every link rusted and stiff. The door was sealed tight, like it had never been moved. But when I walked around back, the ground where the dirt had been torn was covered again, smooth like it had been shoveled overnight. I didn't touch it. That evening, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe the couple had a worker I didn't know about who came by during the night. I sat outside for a while, just listening. The cows were calm again, but the air around the second barn felt strange, like the space itself was heavy. Around 11, I started hearing a low hum coming from that direction. Not a machine, just a soft tone, rising and falling like someone breathing through a hollow pipe. The sound stopped whenever I stepped closer. I'd walk a few feet and it would fade. When I backed away, it returned, same steady rhythm, like it was following my distance. I stood there for nearly 10 minutes, not sure if I should go back inside or wait. Then I heard a soft, metallic sound from the barn door, like a latch sliding on its own. The metallic sound was quiet, but clear enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. It repeated once, a slow scrape of metal against wood, then stopped. I stood still, holding my breath, and watched the thin slivers of light between the barn boards. The glow inside flickered faintly, like there was a candle moving around. I waited to see if it would fade again, but it didn't. It stayed steady, soft and low, like whoever, or whatever, was inside wanted me to know they were there. I walked backward slowly, keeping my eyes on that faint glow. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. It felt wrong to add more light to the dark. When I reached the cabin door, I finally turned and went inside, locking it twice. I pushed the small table against the door and sat down by the window, just watching the barn. The glow never went out. It stayed there all night, pulsing faintly through the cracks. By morning, the light was gone again. The chain was still in place, tight this time, like it hadn't been touched. But the air smelled strange. The same copper scent I'd noticed before, only stronger. It clung to everything, my clothes, the porch railing, even the water in the troughs. I went to check the cows and noticed one was missing. The gate was shut, the fence unbroken, but one of the animals was gone without a trace. I searched the whole property for hours. No hoofprints, no blood, nothing. The grass behind the barn was flattened in a perfect circle, about 6 feet wide, like something heavy had pressed into it. The center of the circle was damp and darker than the rest, the soil soft and cold to the touch. I told myself the cow might have wandered off somehow, even though the fences were too high and the locks too solid. That night, the wind started picking up around sunset. I could hear the boards creak as the air pushed through the cracks in the barns. Around 11, I heard the low hum again. It started faint, almost blending with the wind, and grew clearer, rising and falling in slow intervals. It came from the same place, the second barn. The cows in the pasture shifted uneasily, hooves scraping against the ground. Then, one by one, they turned to face the barn. The hum stopped, replaced by something else. A soft knocking from inside, steady and deliberate, like someone tapping the wood from within. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I sat there listening till it stopped. I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The night was calm again, the air still. The cows were quiet. But the ground under my boots felt soft, like it had been dug up recently. When I got close to the barn, I noticed the chain was missing again. I didn't see it anywhere on the ground. The door was closed, but I could see faint movement through the cracks, the kind of shifting shadow that comes from something pacing slowly. I thought about calling out, but I knew I wouldn't like what answered. Instead, I crouched down and looked under the small gap at the bottom of the door. There was light flickering again inside, but not firelight this time. It was white and unsteady, like something moving underwater. The ground under the gap was wet, and I could see the reflection of that strange light rippling across it. For a moment, I thought I saw something smooth slide across the floor, low to the ground and too long to be a person. It moved slow, deliberate, like it was testing the air near the door. I stood up fast and backed away. The air was warmer near the barn, thick and heavy, carrying that metallic smell again. When I reached the cabin, I could still hear faint noises coming from inside the barn, a slow, dragging sound, followed by something knocking lightly against the boards in uneven intervals. I didn't sleep that night, or the one after. By the time the couple returned, I was ready to leave. I didn't even wait for them to unpack. I just told them I couldn't stay. The husband didn't ask why. He just nodded like he already knew. Before I left, I asked him what was in the second barn. He looked toward it for a long time before saying it was better left closed, that some things buried on the property never stopped moving. I left that same day. A few months later, I heard that they'd sold the place. The new owners tore down both barns. They said when they dug up the ground beneath the second one, they found a hollow space about 20 feet deep, filled with water and mud, but no foundation, just open earth. They filled it with concrete. Still, people who drive by at night say they sometimes see a faint light flickering where the barn used to stand. Story 6. The farm I bought last spring was cheap, cheaper than anything else in that county. It came with a decent house, a few acres of cornfields, and an old silo that leaned slightly to one side. The real estate agent told me the previous owners had left in a hurry, but she didn't say why. The paperwork went fast, and by the time I moved in, it was already mid-May. Everything looked normal enough, empty, quiet, and a little overgrown. The first few weeks were calm. I spent my days clearing weeds, repairing fences, and trying to get the irrigation working again. The house was small but solid. The nights were peaceful too, except for the occasional wind rolling through the corn rows. The only thing that stood out was the silo. It didn't seem stable, so I avoided it. The door was rusted shut, and vines had grown all around the base. There was a faint smell near it, earthy and stale, like wet metal. One evening, I noticed the door to the silo was slightly open. I hadn't touched it since I moved in, so I figured the wind, or maybe the expansion from heat, had loosened it. I tried to push it shut, but it wouldn't move. It was heavy, half buried in mud. I told myself I'd deal with it later. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing a faint hollow thump, spaced out and distant. It wasn't loud, just steady, like something brushing the inside of a metal drum. By morning, the sound had stopped. I almost convinced myself it had been a dream, but when I walked out to the silo, the door was open wider. I could see the edge of the interior, dark and round, lined with brick. The smell was stronger now, still earthy, but mixed with something like rust and stagnant water. I leaned close, but didn't go inside. The air coming out felt heavier than it should, like it carried warmth from underground. That night, the sound returned, clearer this time. It came in slow intervals about every 10 or 15 seconds. A hollow metallic thump from deep inside the silo. I sat on the porch for almost an hour just listening. The sound didn't change. It didn't echo or fade. It stayed steady, the same weight behind each hit. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, caught inside, maybe a raccoon or a bird flapping against the metal, but no creature would keep a rhythm like that. The next morning, I decided to check it properly. I pried the door open with a crowbar, the hinges screaming as they bent. The smell hit first, thick and sour, like wet soil mixed with old iron. I aimed my flashlight inside, but the beam barely reached the floor. The interior walls were streaked with black stains that looked too old to be recent. The floor was covered in what looked like dried mud, uneven and cracked, with a dark pool near the center. I called down once just a quiet hello, though I don't know why I did. The sound didn't echo back. It was swallowed up, like the space inside wasn't empty at all. I dropped a small stone into the pool. It hit the surface, but there was no splash. Just a dull, soft sound, like dropping something onto a wet sponge. I remember standing there, waiting for the ripples to fade, but they didn't. The surface moved, slightly, pulsing in slow waves like it was breathing. That night, the knocking changed. It was faster now, uneven, almost urgent. Sometimes it would stop completely for a few minutes, then start again harder, echoing faintly across the fields. I could hear it even with the windows closed. Around midnight, I saw a faint glow from inside the silo, a pale yellow light that pulsed with the same rhythm as the knocking. I watched from the porch, not daring to move closer. The glow faded around 3 in the morning, and after that, everything went silent again. I woke up early and went out to check. The door was wide open, and there were marks in the dirt leading away from it. Not footprints exactly, more like long, narrow drags spaced a few feet apart. They led toward the back field and stopped just before the first row of corn. The soil there was disturbed, darker, pressed down as if something heavy had been laid there and then moved again. The smell was worse now, strong enough that it clung to my clothes. I covered the silo door with an old tarp and tied it down, but I could still feel the faint vibration through the ground whenever I stood near it, like something deep below was still moving, slow and steady. That evening, the sound started again, softer at first. Then, right around midnight, it changed into something else. Instead of a knock, it sounded like a slow, dragging scrape, circling the inside walls of the silo. It went on for hours, steady and deliberate, until the sound seemed to shift upward, closer to the top. When it stopped, I realized the night had gone completely still. Even the crickets had gone quiet. I didn't go outside. I stayed awake the rest of that night, sitting near the window with the lights off. The glow inside the silo had gone out, but the dark felt heavier, like it pressed against the walls of the house. Every so often, I thought I heard the faint scrape of something moving across metal, then a pause, and then the same sound again, slower. It never lasted long enough for me to be sure it was real. Around 4 in the morning, the sound stopped completely. I waited another hour before I let myself close my eyes. When I woke up, it was already past noon. The first thing I noticed was that the tarp over the silo door was gone. The ropes were still tied, but they were lying flat against the ground, neat and straight. The wind hadn't done that. I walked closer, careful not to step on the wet patch that had spread out from the base of the door. The dirt there was darker than before, soft and uneven, like something had shifted underneath. Inside, the light was dim, but I could tell the surface of the pool had changed. It was higher, closer to the edge. The faint smell of iron and wet soil filled the air again. I could see movement below the surface this time, small ripples spreading outward, even though there was no wind, no insects, nothing to disturb it. I only watched for a moment before I backed away. I didn't want to see what might rise from it. The rest of that day, the farm felt wrong. The animals were restless. The few chickens I had wouldn't come out of the coop. Even the flies that usually gathered near the water troughs were gone. The silence was heavy, unnatural. I decided I'd leave the next morning and call someone to come seal the silo for good. I spent the afternoon packing what I could and left the lights on in every room that night. Around midnight, the house started shaking. Not violently, just a slow, steady tremor that rattled the windows and made the glasses on the counter hum. I thought it was an earthquake at first, but the vibration wasn't coming from the ground. It was rhythmic, pulsing from one direction, the silo. The sound returned too, but different now. It wasn't just a knock or scrape. It was something dragging, heavy, moving upward through the metal shell. The noise got louder until I could tell it had reached the top. Then there was a single, loud clang, like the roof hatch had slammed open. The air inside the house changed at that moment. It felt thicker, damp and warm, carrying that same metallic scent. The lights flickered once, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. I didn't move. I just sat in the corner of the kitchen, gripping the flashlight. About 10 minutes later, something hit the ground outside with a dull, heavy sound. It didn't echo. It was too close. I stood up slowly and went to the window. The yard was darker than usual. The moonlight didn't seem to reach the field. I could see the outline of the silo taller somehow, its top opening faintly visible. Then, at the edge of the corn rows, I saw the plants moving. Not from the wind. Each row shifted in sequence, like something was crawling between them. The movement was slow, steady, and silent, except for the faint sound of the stalks brushing together. I shut the curtains and waited. I don't know how long I stood there, but the movement eventually stopped. The night stayed quiet. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. When the first light came through the window, I finally stepped outside. The air was still damp and warm. The field looked normal at first glance, but there were deep furrows in the soil between the corn rows, as if something wide and heavy had slid through during the night. The ground near the silo door was cracked, sunken inward like something had pulled itself out. The door itself was hanging open, the hinges bent. The pool inside was gone. The floor was dry, except for a few dark streaks that ran in a spiral toward the center, ending at a small hole in the ground no wider than a bucket. When I leaned closer, I couldn't see the bottom. It just went down into complete darkness, deeper than it should have. That was the last night I stayed there. I packed my truck and left that morning, didn't even bother closing the gate behind me. A week later, I called the county office to report a structural hazard. Told them the silo was unsafe and could collapse. They said they'd check it. But when I drove past 2 months later, the silo was gone. No debris, no rubble, not even a patch of disturbed dirt where it had stood. Just corn growing in a perfect circle, taller and greener than the rest of the field. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear that same faint, hollow thump. When the wind hits the walls of my house, it's always the same rhythm, slow and even. I try to ignore it, but sometimes I think I can feel it in the floor, like it's echoing up from deep underground, right beneath me. Story 7. The chicken farm I worked on last year sat at the end of a dirt road that no one used anymore. The owners, an older couple, lived in a trailer a few yards from the main coop. They hired me to help with repairs and cleaning because their son, who used to handle everything, had left without saying much. They didn't talk about him, and I didn't ask. I just did my job and stayed quiet. The work was simple: feeding, cleaning, fixing loose boards. What I didn't understand at first was why the entire west side of the property was fenced off with barbed wire running straight through the woods. The first week went fine. The chickens were noisy, the air smelled like hay and dust, And the old woman always left food for me in a lunchbox by the gate. She told me not to stay past sunset, said the generator didn't always work right at night. I took that as a warning about raccoons or coyotes. But after a few days, I started noticing something strange about the west fence. Every morning there were fresh marks in the dirt along the inside edge, like something had walked parallel to it during the night. The prints weren't clear, too wide to be from a person, too long for an animal. I tried mentioning it once, but the old man just said to ignore it. He told me they'd had trouble before and didn't want it stirred up again. His voice was flat, like he was tired of repeating it. After that, I kept my mouth shut, but I couldn't stop thinking about what he meant. One afternoon, I stayed late, finishing repairs on one of the chicken houses. The sun was low, and the light coming through the slats painted thin orange lines across the floor. That was when I heard it. The faint sound of scraping metal, steady and slow, coming from the trees near the fence. It wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, like something dragging along the wire. I stepped outside, wiping my hands, and looked toward the tree line. The sound stopped immediately. I waited for a while, but nothing moved. The woods beyond the fence were dense and dark, too thick for me to see far. I decided to finish up and leave before it got dark. As I walked back toward my truck, I looked behind me and noticed the chickens had all gone still. Every one of them faced the same direction, toward the fence. I stood there watching for a minute, and then one of them let out a sharp, single cry like it had been startled. The rest didn't move. I came back the next morning and found the west fence bent in one section. The barbed wire had been pulled outward, not inward, like something from inside the property had tried to get out. The dirt beneath it was smooth, freshly turned, with a shallow impression running underneath the wire as if something long and heavy had been dragged through the soil. I told the old man, and he nodded like he already knew. He said he'd fix it himself and told me to work on the east side instead. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I couldn't stop hearing that scraping sound in my head. Around 2 a.m, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the old woman. Just 3 words. Don't go tomorrow. I read it twice, trying to make sense of it, but before I could respond, the screen flickered and went black. When I tried turning it back on, it wouldn't start. The next morning, I went anyway. The air was colder than usual, and the sky was the color of ash. The old couple wasn't outside. Their trailer door was shut, and there was no smoke from the chimney. The gate to the farm was open, though, swinging slightly in the wind. I walked through and noticed right away that the chickens were silent. Not one sound from the coops. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. All the doors to the chicken houses were open, every single one. The ground was covered in loose feathers and torn feed bags. The wire fence on the west side was gone, completely flattened. The soil where it had stood was dark and uneven, like it had been turned from underneath. There were marks in the dirt, long, deep grooves running straight from the woods to the coops. I started walking backward without realizing it. The silence was so thick it felt like it had weight. Even the wind had stopped. I reached my truck and turned to leave, but I caught something in the corner of my eye. A faint movement near the farthest coop. The door there was swinging slowly, tapping against the frame, though there was no breeze. I couldn't see what was inside. The smell hit next. It wasn't death or rot, but something like wet iron and soil mixed together. It burned slightly when I breathed in. I stood there for maybe half a minute before I got in the truck and drove straight down that dirt road without looking back. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the message the old woman had sent. I tried calling, but the number wouldn't go through. The next day, I went back one last time. The sky was overcast that morning, flat, gray, and still. The dirt road to the farm felt longer than usual, quiet except for the hum of the tires. I kept expecting to see the old couple's truck parked near the gate, but it wasn't there. The farm looked empty, the same as I'd left it, only worse. The gate was still open, leaning halfway off one hinge. The wind had picked up a little, enough to make the tall grass shift in slow waves, but it didn't move the hanging coupe doors. They just stood open, perfectly still. When I got out of the truck, the smell hit me right away. It was stronger than before, that same metallic tang, mixed with damp soil and something sour underneath. It was thick enough that it made the air feel heavier. I walked carefully across the yard, past the empty feed bins and the flattened west fence. The ground there had sunk deeper, like something had tunneled under it. I could see dark soil mounded up in uneven piles that stretched from the edge of the woods to the back of the coupes. The silence was worse than the smell. Even the birds that usually perched along the fence posts were gone. Every sound I made, my boots on gravel, the creak of the coupe doors, felt too loud. I moved to the trailer to see if the old couple was inside. The door was unlocked. The air inside was cold, like the windows had been open all night. Everything looked normal at first. 2 coffee cups on the counter, a plate with crumbs, the old man's work jacket hanging on the back of a chair. Then I noticed the footprints, faint but clear. They led from the door to the back wall of the trailer. The floor there was wet, not with water, but something darker, sticky like mud. The prints ended right at the wall itself. The paneling had a long vertical crack running down the center, and around that crack the wallpaper was bulging slightly outward, as if the wall wasn't solid anymore. I reached out and pressed my hand against it. It gave under the pressure. The panel shifted, and a small bit of dark soil crumbled out from behind it, falling onto the floor. I stepped back quickly. Behind that wall there was the faint sound of movement. Not loud, but steady, something sliding or shifting slowly through dirt. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped completely. I left the trailer and walked back toward the coupes. I don't know why I didn't just leave then. Maybe I needed to see for myself that the chickens were really gone. Inside the first coop, feathers covered the floor like snow. The air was warm and stale, and there were marks in the sawdust, deep grooves that spiraled outward from the center, like something had burrowed up through the ground. Each groove was wide and smooth, the edges still damp. The next 2 coops were the same, empty, feathers, spiral grooves. By the 4th one, I could feel the boards shifting slightly under my boots, just a faint give, like the ground beneath wasn't solid. I crouched down and touched the floor. The wood was warm. Not from sunlight, it was still early and the air outside was cold. The warmth was coming from below. That was when I heard it again. A low scraping sound, like stone against wood moving under the floor. It passed directly beneath me, slow and heavy, making the dust rise in small puffs around my boots. I froze. The boards flexed slightly, as if something was pushing up from underneath. Then it moved away, dragging toward the next coop. I backed out, trying not to make noise, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I made it halfway to the truck before I heard the sound again, this time behind me, near the trailer. The ground shifted just once, enough to make the dirt crack along the path I'd walked. The movement stopped near the old couple's porch. For a long time, nothing else happened. Then there was a single muffled sound, like a breath being pulled through wet soil. After that, silence again. I got in my truck and left. I didn't even look in the mirrors until I was miles down the road. When I finally did, all I could see was the faint outline of the farm behind me. The coops standing open, the fence half buried, and a thin strip of dark soil leading from the tree line all the way to the house. A few days later, I drove by again, just once from the highway. The farm was gone. The coops, the trailer, the fence, all of it had been cleared like it had never existed. The field was bare, freshly leveled, the dirt smooth and pale except for one long, dark patch near the center that stretched in a straight line into the woods. The air around that stretch of road still smelled faintly like iron. Sometimes, when I think about that place, I remember the old woman's message. Don't go tomorrow. I still wonder if she sent it before or after she heard something under the floor. There was a rule at the diner where I worked that nobody was supposed to go into the walk-in freezer alone after midnight. It wasn't an official rule, just something everyone followed without question. The night manager, an older guy named Frank, said it started after one of the cooks had a breakdown in there a few years back. I never asked what happened because everyone brushed it off like it was nothing serious. I started working there last summer, mostly closing shifts because I needed the extra pay. The diner stayed open 24 hours, and the last few hours before sunrise were always the quietest. Usually it was just me, Frank, and the dishwasher named Lenny. The place always had this heavy silence during those hours. The music was turned off, and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerators and the clink of dishes. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, the air inside the diner always felt different. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, and sometimes I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the window, like someone passing by outside, but when I looked, there was nobody. The diner sat along a long stretch of highway surrounded by woods, so we didn't get much foot traffic. I told myself it was just my eyes adjusting. The freezer door was right at the back of the kitchen. It had a big latch that made a deep click when it locked. Sometimes it jammed, and Frank had to hit it with a wrench to get it open. I remember that sound clearly because it echoed through the metal walls. When I first started, I'd go in there without thinking twice. But after a few weeks, I started feeling uneasy whenever I had to step inside. The light inside was dim and bluish, and it flickered sometimes, which made the shelves look like they were shifting slightly. One night, around 1:45 a.m., we got a delivery that needed to go straight into the freezer. Frank told me to help Lenny with it while he went to the office to finish paperwork. Lenny and I carried in the boxes one by one. He was always quiet, but that night he seemed even quieter. I tried to make small talk, but he didn't respond. When I turned to look at him, he wasn't there anymore. The door to the freezer was open, so I figured he went inside. I followed him in, holding another box. The cold hit my face, and I could see my breath right away. I called his name softly, but the sound felt muffled by the walls. I saw his outline near the back, crouched by the shelves, facing away from me. I didn't think much of it at first. I walked a few steps closer and told him we still had a few boxes left. He didn't move. I thought maybe he didn't hear me over the fans. When I set the box down, I realized something was off. His clothes looked wrong. Lenny usually wore a white shirt and dark pants, but what I was seeing looked darker, almost wet. I blinked, and he wasn't there anymore. The space behind the shelves was empty. I turned around quickly, thinking he'd gone out, but the door was still open, and nobody was near it. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to listen. The fans hummed steadily, and the light flickered once. I felt that strange cold run through me, not just from the air, but something else. My hands started shaking. I picked up the box and walked out fast, trying not to look back. When I stepped into the kitchen, Frank was coming toward me. I asked him where Lenny went, and he said Lenny had left early because he wasn't feeling well. I wanted to tell him what I saw, but I couldn't find the words. I just nodded and went back to work. Every time I passed that freezer after that, I felt something watching from inside. Sometimes when I closed it, I thought I heard a faint knock from the other side, but I tried to ignore it. A week after that night, the freezer started acting strange. The temperature gauge kept dropping lower than normal, even though the settings hadn't changed. Frank said it was probably the sensor and told me not to worry. But when I stepped inside one morning to restock the meat trays, it felt colder than before, the kind of cold that hurt your teeth when you breathed in. I remember how quiet it was in there. Usually you could hear the low hum of the motor, but that time it sounded muffled, like the sound was being pushed away. I didn't want to stay long. As I stacked boxes, I noticed frost forming thicker than usual on the back wall. It looked uneven, like it had a shape under it. I leaned in closer and saw what looked like an imprint, like someone had pressed against the metal from the inside, a full outline of a shoulder and hand. I stepped back fast, thinking maybe it was just ice buildup. But as I stared at it, I realized the handprint wasn't frozen flat like normal frost. It was sunken inward, like the metal itself had a slight dent. I ran my glove over it, and the dent felt real. I didn't tell Frank because I didn't want to sound crazy, but I avoided that wall every time after. That same night, the weird sound started again. It wasn't the usual knocking I'd heard before. It was softer this time, almost like tapping, coming in uneven rhythms. Sometimes it was from inside the freezer. Other times it seemed to move to the walls behind the shelves. When I tried to ignore it, it would stop. But the moment I looked back at the freezer door, it would start again. A few nights later, I stayed late to clean the fryer. Frank went home early, and it was just me and the hum of the lights. Around 2:30 a.m., I realized I hadn't seen Lenny for a few days. I thought maybe he'd quit, but nobody mentioned it. The replacement dishwasher didn't seem to know who I was talking about when I asked. He said there wasn't any Lenny on the schedule list for that week. That confused me. I'd worked with him for weeks. I remembered his quiet way of moving, how he never said much. When I checked the staff board near the office, his name really wasn't there. I even looked through the punch-in sheet, but there was no trace of him. I thought maybe Frank had just forgotten to write him in, so I didn't press it. When I went back into the kitchen, I noticed the freezer door was open again. It was the same half-open way I'd seen it before, with the mist rolling out along the floor. I knew I hadn't opened it. I felt that same pressure in my chest, like the air had turned heavier. The lights above flickered twice, then held steady. I forced myself to walk toward it, just to close it. I tried not to look inside, but my eyes moved anyway. I could see the frost on the back wall again, thicker than ever, and that same imprint was deeper now, like something had been pushing from inside. There were faint streaks on the floor too, thin trails in the frost leading to the shelves. I shut the door fast, making sure the latch clicked. I stood there for a while, listening, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. When I finally left that night, the air outside felt strange, like the warmth didn't touch me right away. I got in my car and sat for a minute before driving off. In the rearview mirror, I could see the diner's lights glowing faintly through the trees. Just before I pulled out of the lot, I thought I saw someone standing by the back door. It looked like Lenny, still wearing his stained apron, his head slightly tilted like he was waiting. I blinked, and the spot was empty. The next day, Frank said the freezer had stopped working overnight. He found the door frozen shut. They called maintenance to defrost it. I didn't go near it again. A few weeks later, I quit without telling anyone why. I still think about that place sometimes, especially when I pass by diners late at night. Every time I see one, I picture that freezer door and the faint outline pressed against the wall, like someone still inside, waiting for someone else to open it. Story 2. There used to be a small restaurant downtown that everyone in my area knew for its homemade pies. It was an old family place, one of those diners that had been around for decades and never really changed. I worked there for about 6 months when I was 21, mostly waiting tables and helping close at night. It wasn't a bad job, but there was always something about that place that didn't sit right with me, especially the basement. The restaurant had a narrow staircase in the back that led down to a small prep area and dry storage. The air down there always felt damp, like it never completely dried out no matter how many times it was cleaned. The owners said the building was old and the foundation just soaked up water after rain. The light bulbs flickered even after being replaced. The concrete walls were stained dark in patches, and sometimes I'd swear it smelled faintly like metal. I didn't go down there much at first. The cooks handled most of the storage runs, but as new people got hired and others quit, I started taking turns getting supplies. The first few times it was fine. I'd grab flour or extra canned goods and get out quick. But after a while, I began to notice strange things down there. It started small, like finding items moved around or stacked differently than how I left them. Sometimes a box would be halfway open, with the lid peeled back like someone had checked inside, even though nobody had been down since me. One night, near closing, the head cook asked me to grab a new bag of sugar from the basement. I remember checking the time, 11:43 p.m., because the digital clock by the register always caught my eye before I headed down. I grabbed the keys and made my way down the steps. Each step creaked softly, and my shoes stuck slightly to the floor when I reached the bottom. The light overhead flickered twice before it steadied, casting that pale yellow glow across the shelves. As I bent to pick up the bag, I heard something move behind me, just a light shuffle. I froze, thinking maybe a mouse was down there. We'd had a few before. I waited for the sound again, but it didn't come. I shook it off, grabbed the sugar, and headed back up. Halfway up the stairs, I glanced down for some reason, and I could have sworn I saw someone's leg disappear behind one of the shelves. I stopped cold. The light flickered again. I waited for a full minute, trying to listen, but all I heard was that faint electric buzz. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I imagined it, because of how the shadows moved. But when I went up and back to the counter, my hands were shaking so much that the cook asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. After that, I avoided going down there whenever I could. But it became harder to do that because the owners were cutting corners, and they wanted fewer people on shift. Sometimes it was just me and one cook for the whole night. On those nights, I had to go down for everything. That's when things started getting weirder. I'd hear light tapping coming from below the floor when I stood near the register. It wasn't pipes or the refrigerator. It sounded deliberate, like knuckles brushing against the ceiling. Sometimes it would stop when I moved, then start again as soon as I stood still. One night, I went down there to grab napkins, and I swear the air was heavier, like it had soaked up something. There was this faint humming sound, almost like breathing through fabric. I remember that night more clearly than any other. The air was still, but I could feel something like static on my skin. As I reached for the shelf, I noticed the floor was damp again, a thin layer of water spreading slowly from the corner. It wasn't leaking from anywhere I could see. The smell hit me then. That same faint metallic scent, but stronger now, mixed with something sour. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on that corner. I didn't see movement, but the air seemed to ripple slightly, like heat waves. When I turned to leave, the light above me flickered hard, going dark for half a second. In that flash of darkness, I thought I saw something crouched low in the far corner. It was quick, like a shape made of shadow, hunched and still. When the light came back on, nothing was there. The water had stopped moving too. I left the bag of napkins and ran up the stairs, trying not to look behind me. After that, I couldn't bring myself to go down anymore. The other workers started saying they were hearing noises too. Some said they'd found wet footprints leading up the stairs after closing, but nobody wanted to talk about it much. The owners acted like they didn't hear any of it. I stayed for another few weeks, but each shift felt worse than the last. It got to the point where none of us wanted to close alone. Even the cooks, who had been there for years, started finding excuses to leave early. The owner's son started helping with the late shift, but he didn't last long either. After his first week, he refused to. He'd go down to the basement at all. He never said why. The next month, the smell got worse. It wasn't constant. Just random bursts that came through the floor vents. It was strongest near the prep counter and always late at night. The first time it happened, I thought something had spoiled, so I checked all the refrigerators, but they were fine. The smell was strange, heavy, damp, and sharp. Everyone described it differently. But to me, it smelled like old coins mixed with something rotting. One night, near closing, I stayed behind to finish wiping down the tables while the others went out back for a smoke. The restaurant was quiet except for the hum of the soda machine and the faint rattle of the vent fan. I was halfway through stacking chairs when I heard the basement door open. It made this slow, dragging sound when it moved, like the hinges were rusted. I froze for a second because I knew nobody else had gone down there in hours. The guys were still outside. I waited, expecting to hear footsteps on the stairs, but nothing came. Just that faint creak of the door shifting back and forth. I slowly moved toward the kitchen, trying not to make noise. The air got cooler as I got closer. I could see the basement door through the pass window. It was open about halfway, and there was no light coming from below. For some reason, I thought maybe one of the guys had gone down without telling me, so I called out softly. But I didn't hear anything back. Just the fan and the faint dripping sound coming from somewhere below. My hands were sweating. I grabbed a flashlight from under the counter and stepped closer. I didn't want to go down there, but leaving it open like that felt worse. When I reached the doorway, I aimed the flashlight down the stairs. The beam landed on the bottom step, catching the edge of the wet floor. The concrete glistened, darker than usual. I could see the shelves in the distance, but the corner where I'd seen that shape before looked completely black, like the light couldn't reach it. The smell hit me again, thick and sour. I took one step down and felt the wood under me groan. Then something moved at the bottom. Not a full movement, just a small shift, like someone leaning slightly. I froze, holding the light steady. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The shape didn't move again, but I could see a faint reflection off the wet floor, as if something smooth was there. I couldn't tell if it was water or something else. The light started flickering then, dimming and returning in quick bursts. For a second, it caught something on the wall, long streaks that looked like handprints sliding down the concrete, dark and uneven. The smell got stronger. I felt something like a pulse through the floor, just one dull vibration that made the shelves rattle slightly. I ran back up without thinking, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The others came in a few minutes later and saw my face. I told them the door had been open and I thought I heard something. They didn't ask much after that, just went silent and finished cleaning fast. Nobody wanted to talk about it. The next morning, the owner came in furious because the basement lock was broken. He said someone must have been fooling around with the latch because it was bent out of shape. He also said there was water all over the floor and something had clogged the drain. But when maintenance came to check, They said there wasn't any leak or blockage, just standing water that disappeared after a few hours. I quit 2 weeks later. I told them I found another job, but really, I just couldn't go back there. That smell still comes back to me sometimes. I'll be walking past a restaurant vent or standing near an old basement door, and it'll hit me for a second. That metallic rot, faint but sharp. It always makes my stomach twist. I drove by that diner a few months ago. It's closed now. Windows boarded up, sign gone. There was a notice from the city taped to the front door saying something about foundation repairs and possible contamination. I didn't stop to read the rest. I just kept driving. And I swear, when I passed the alley behind it, I saw the basement door still there, open just a few inches, the darkness inside looking thicker than it should have. Story 3. There was a little sushi place I used to work at after college, tucked between two laundromats on a quiet street. It didn't look like much from the outside, but it was always busy because of the cheap lunch specials. I worked there mostly evenings, helping close up. The owner, Mr. Tanaka, barely spoke English, but he was polite and quiet. The only thing he ever repeated to me clearly was not to stay after hours. He said it every night before leaving, like a habit. Never stay late. The kitchen was small, lined with stainless steel counters that always smelled faintly like vinegar and rice. The back room was darker, with one window that never opened and a single hanging bulb. That's where we prepped the fish for the next day. The floor tiles were always slick, no matter how many times we mopped. Sometimes when I stood there alone, I'd hear soft dripping, even though there were no pipes nearby. At first, I didn't pay attention to it. Restaurants make all kinds of noises. But after a few weeks, I started realizing that the dripping sound only happened when I was the last one there. Around 11 p.m., when I turned off the radio and started cleaning the cutting boards, it would begin. Slow, steady drops like water hitting metal. I'd check the sink, the pipes, the ceiling. Nothing was wet. The sound always came from behind the storage rack, near the wall where the paint was darker. One night, I decided to check it properly. I moved the rack away from the wall, expecting maybe a small leak or a loose pipe. But behind it was just bare wall, concrete with a few cracks and stains. The strange thing was the wall felt damp, cold to the touch, even though the rest of the room was warm. I pressed my hand against it, and the dripping sound stopped completely. I left it alone after that. I didn't even tell anyone, because it felt stupid to bring up. But the nights after that got stranger. The dripping would start earlier, sometimes before the others even left. It wasn't loud, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. And the smell started coming in too. A faint one at first, like wet fish left out too long. Then it got stronger, thicker, until it hung in the air even after cleaning. The owner noticed it too and blamed the drains, but the plumbers couldn't find anything wrong. The sound began to change after a while. It wasn't dripping anymore. It was slower, heavier, more like something thick falling instead of water. Every time it happened, that damp wall seemed darker. The paint near the floor started peeling upward, curling at the edges. One night I leaned closer and realized the end paint wasn't peeling. It was soft, like it had absorbed moisture. When I pressed it, it left an indentation, almost like skin. The next night I stayed a little later than usual because the delivery guy was late. By the time I finished unloading boxes, it was almost midnight. Everyone else had gone home. The only light was from the hanging bulb above the prep table. I turned off the radio, and right on cue, that sound started again. Slow, wet drops from behind the rack. I told myself I'd ignore it. I focused on wiping the counters, but my eyes kept drifting to that wall. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, like something was sliding down the inside of the wall. Then, for the first time, I heard a soft thud, like something hitting the other side of it. The bulb flickered once, and I nearly dropped the cloth. The air had changed. It felt heavier, sticky. I could smell that fishy odor again, but underneath it was something else, like old meat left too long in the heat, and kept staring at that wall, waiting for it to stop. But the dripping didn't stop this time. It grew faster, steadier, almost rhythmic. I felt something inside me tighten, this sharp instinct to leave right then. I turned off the light, grabbed my bag, and walked straight to the front. Before locking the door, I looked back once. The prep room was dark except for the faint light coming through the street window. In that dim light, I thought I saw a movement along the floor where the wall met the tiles, like a small ripple or shadow sliding along the baseboard. I blinked and it was gone, but that smell stayed. The next day, when I came in for my shift, there was a dark stain spreading from that corner all the way to the middle of the floor. Mr. Tanaka was already there, staring at it quietly. He didn't say anything when I walked in. He just told me to stay out of the back room for the day and started covering the stain with salt. He didn't use cleaning supplies, just poured salt across it until the floor turned white. After that day, the back room stayed locked. Mr. Tanaka didn't explain anything, and none of us asked. Every time someone tried to mention the smell, he'd just shake his head and say the drains were fine. But everyone knew something wasn't right. The air in the kitchen felt thicker, like it was carrying moisture that never left. The walls had a faint, damp look, even when we wiped them dry. A week later, the late shift started to feel wrong. The restaurant used to close around 11, but the prep work kept us another hour. During that last hour, the sounds returned. They didn't come from the wall anymore. They came from underneath the floor. It was subtle at first, like something shifting in the pipes. But then there were dull thuds, slow and uneven, like something heavy bumping against the underside of the tiles. The others joked about it being rats. I wanted to believe that, but rats don't make sounds that deep. It was lower, slower, almost like breathing. Every time I felt it through the soles of my shoes, my chest tightened. One night, I stayed late again. I didn't want to, but one of the waiters had called off, and I needed the hours. It was almost midnight when I finished wiping down the counters. The kitchen was spotless, the way Mr. Tanaka liked it. I was just about to leave when I heard something behind me. A soft scrape. I turned, and the door to the back room was open. It hadn't been open in days. The lock was old and stiff. I'd seen Mr. Tanaka check it himself. But there it was, open just enough to see the darkness inside. No light, no sound. I should have left. Every part of me told me to walk out. But I stood there instead, staring at that door like something was holding my attention. The smell hit first, sharp and metallic, mixed with that same rotten sweetness. I stepped closer without meaning to. The light above me flickered twice, and in that quick flash, I saw something on the floor just inside the room. It looked like wet fabric, maybe a towel or a rag. But then it shifted slightly, like something breathing under it. I took one more step, and the floor under my shoe made a sticky sound. I looked down and saw the tiles near the doorway glistening, like thin liquid had seeped up through the grout lines. The dripping sound started again, slow and steady, from somewhere deeper inside the room. My hand was shaking when I reached for the light switch, but before I touched it, I heard a noise that froze me completely. It was a wet, dragging sound, like something pulling across the floor slowly. Then came a soft sound, almost like a sigh, low and close, right near the ground. The light flickered once more, and for just a second I thought I saw a pale hand pressing against the floor tiles from underneath the surface. It slid slightly, then sank back down. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the wet floor. The sound stopped immediately. The air went still. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge and my own heartbeat. I didn't even close the door. I just turned and left, walking fast, then running once I got outside. The next morning, I went back to pick up my last paycheck. The restaurant was closed early. The front lights were off, and the kitchen door was locked. I waited outside until Mr. Tanaka arrived. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept. He handed me my envelope without saying a word. When I asked if everything was okay, he just said the restaurant would be closed for a few days for maintenance. 2 weeks later, I passed by and saw the windows covered in brown paper. A for lease sign hung on the door. I never saw Mr. Tanaka again. I still think about that place sometimes, especially when I pass by other sushi restaurants and smell that faint mix of vinegar and raw fish. Sometimes, if I stand too long, I swear I can hear that slow dripping sound again, steady and patient, like it's waiting behind a wall somewhere, still looking for a way through. Story 4. The breakfast place I worked at for a while was one of those cheerful family spots that always had the smell of coffee and syrup in the air. It was small, tucked in the corner of a strip mall, with big windows facing the parking lot. During the day, it felt normal, almost cozy. But at night, when we stayed late to prep for the morning rush, it felt like a different place. The colors faded under the fluorescent lights, and the hum from the kitchen vents echoed strange against the empty booths. The owner, Susan, was friendly but strict about closing routines. Every night, everything had to be spotless. Counters wiped twice, syrup bottles cleaned, coffee pots scrubbed, and every light turned off in a specific order. She said it saved energy and helped the overnight cleaning crew find their way around. The funny thing was, I never saw any cleaning crew. None of us did. The place was always spotless by morning, but no one ever caught whoever was doing it. I worked the night shift with another waitress named Hannah. We got along fine. She was older, quiet, and didn't talk much unless she needed to. Around midnight, we'd always make a fresh pot of coffee to get through the last few hours. The place would be silent except for the dripping of the coffee machine and the buzz of the soda fridge. That silence was comforting at first, but then we started hearing other noises. It started with faint clinking sounds like dishes moving in the kitchen. We'd stop and listen, thinking maybe something had shifted from the vibration of the cooler. But sometimes it sounded like someone setting plates down, slow and careful. The first few times we went back there to check, but nothing was out of place. The doors were locked and all the dishes were stacked neatly. Then one night I stayed a bit later than usual because Susan had asked me to double-check the syrup dispensers. Hannah had already gone home. It was around 2:30 a.m. and the diner was dead quiet. I finished wiping the tables and went to the kitchen for one last check. When I stepped through the swinging doors, I noticed the air felt colder, even though the ovens were off. The lights above the prep station were flickering slightly, and one of the coffee mugs was sitting on the counter by itself. I hadn't left it there. I stood for a minute, thinking maybe Hannah forgot it, but something about the way it sat there bothered me. It wasn't near the sink or the drying rack. It was in the middle of the counter, perfectly centered. I picked it up to put it away, and when I turned toward the dish station, I heard another mug clink down behind me. I turned back fast, but there was nothing there, just the empty counter. I placed the mug down again and stepped back. For a few seconds, everything was still. Then I heard it again, but softer this time, like porcelain tapping metal, coming from deeper in the kitchen. I followed the sound toward the storage room. The small door in the back led to a narrow hallway where we kept extra supplies. The lights were dim, and one of them was flickering in and out. I could hear faint movement up ahead, but not footsteps, just soft scraping, like something being slid across the floor. I thought maybe Susan had come in early. I called her name, but my voice sounded strange in that small space, swallowed up almost instantly. When I turned the corner, I saw the door to the walk-in fridge was slightly open. A thin strip of cold air drifted out. I didn't remember leaving it open. I walked closer, my shoes sticking slightly to the floor from the cleaning solution. The light inside the fridge was flickering too, and I could see shadows from the shelves stretching across the floor. I stood there for a while, staring in, waiting to hear something. The cold air brushed against my face, sharp and dry. There was no movement, but I had that same strange feeling I used to get as a kid when I knew someone was behind me even though I couldn't see them. I backed up slowly and pushed the door shut until it clicked. Then I turned to leave, and for a split second, I caught sight of something in the reflection on the freezer door, a pale outline standing near the prep counter. I blinked, and it was gone. I looked around the kitchen. Everything was quiet again. The coffee machine clicked softly in the corner, and the lights stopped flickering. I told myself I was just tired and seeing things. I went to the front to grab my bag, but before I turned off the lights, I looked back toward the kitchen one more time. All the mugs were gone. Every single one, from the drying rack, the shelves, and the counter. I stood there frozen, staring at the empty space where they'd been. Then, from somewhere deep in the kitchen, I heard the soft sound of porcelain tapping metal again, slow, rhythmic, like someone gently stacking cups in the dark. The next morning, I came in early because Susan had texted, all of us saying she wanted to check the cameras. I hadn't said anything about what I'd seen, but I guessed someone must have noticed something strange too. When I got there, she was already sitting in the back office, watching the small monitor on the desk. The screen showed 4 camera feeds, one for the dining area, one for the register, one for the kitchen, and one aimed down the narrow hallway by the fridge. She didn't say a word when I walked in, just pointed to the screen. I leaned over and saw the timestamp from 2:37 a.m., the same time I'd been cleaning the night before. The footage showed me walking through the kitchen, picking up the mug, setting it back down, and heading toward the hallway. So far, it was normal. But then, as soon as I disappeared into the hallway, another mug slid across the counter by itself. It didn't fall or tip. It slid about 6 inches, stopped perfectly, and stayed upright. Susan paused the footage there and looked at me. She asked if I'd touched anything magnetic or spilled something slippery that could make it move like that. I told her no. She just stared at the screen for a long time, then said she'd seen other strange things on the recordings before, things moving slightly, lights flickering when the power was fine, shapes passing between the cameras that never showed up clearly. She said the cleaning crew had mentioned hearing voices too, which confused me because I'd never actually seen a cleaning crew in person. After that, Susan told me to avoid staying past 2 in the morning. She said the overnight workers would handle the rest. I didn't ask any more questions. For a few nights, everything was fine. I made sure to clock out early and leave with Hannah. We didn't talk about it, but I could tell she felt the same unease. Then one Friday night, the dishwasher broke. We had to stay late to rinse everything by hand. It was nearly 3 when Hannah finally went home. I stayed behind a few minutes, longer, to finish wiping the counter. The diner was completely silent. The lights buzzed faintly, and I could hear the clock ticking near the register. As I turned off the last light, I heard a single mug clink from the kitchen. Just one. I froze where I stood. The sound came again, softer, like porcelain tapping steel. I didn't want to look, but my body moved before I could stop it. I stepped through the swinging door, the dark shapes of the counters stretching out under the faint light from the exit sign. The mugs were back, all of them perfectly stacked on the drying rack. I stood there staring, and then I noticed something odd. The top mug wasn't sitting flat. It was tilted slightly, like something inside it was pushing up from underneath. I took a few steps closer. The light from the exit sign flickered once, and I could see a thin line of moisture trickling down the side of the mug. Then, as I watched, one of the other mugs slid half an inch toward the edge. Slowly, carefully, like someone was moving it from the inside. I backed away until my back hit the door. My breath sounded loud in the still air. The mugs didn't fall. They just moved one by one, turning slightly until every handle faced the same direction, toward the door where I stood. I ran. I didn't grab my bag or my jacket. I just pushed through the front door and kept going until I reached my car. I sat there for a long time, shaking, staring at the diner through the windshield. The lights were still on inside, even though I'd turned them off. The next morning, I called Susan to tell her I couldn't work there anymore. She didn't sound surprised. She just said she understood, and that the diner would be closing for a bit anyway. A few weeks later, I passed by and saw paper over the windows, just like that sushi place. A sign taped to the door said, "Closed for maintenance." But when I looked through a gap in the paper, I could see the counter, clean and empty, and one mug, sitting perfectly centered on it, handle turned toward the door. I haven't eaten breakfast at a diner since. Story 5. There was a steakhouse I worked at during college, one of those dimly lit places with heavy chairs, old framed photos on the walls, and country music playing quietly in the background. It was nice during dinner hours, full of noise and warmth, but when closing time came, the building felt entirely different. The lights dimmed even more, the music stopped, and everything seemed to sink into silence. I was a busser then, so my job was to clear tables and reset for the next day. We closed at midnight, but cleanup usually took another hour. The manager, Rob, was the last to leave. He'd walk around with his clipboard, checking that all the lights were off, except for the ones in the kitchen and near the bar. He always told us to stay out of the storage room behind the walk-in freezer. He said it was just old supplies and electrical stuff, but the way he said it always made me curious. That room was built differently from the rest of the restaurant. The walls were rough concrete instead of tile, and there was a low hum that never stopped. The door didn't fit right either. It scraped the floor when open. Sometimes, if you were working near the kitchen late at night, you could hear a faint tapping coming from that side of the wall. The sound came in sets of 3, always soft and even. I thought maybe it was pipes, but it only ever happened after closing. One night, Rob had to leave early because his kid was sick, and he asked me to finish locking up. It was my first time closing alone. The place felt massive and hollow without the others. I moved slowly, stacking chairs, wiping tables, double-checking the cash drawer. The quiet pressed in from every corner. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed the hum from the storage room was louder than usual. It had a deeper vibration, almost like a generator straining. I ignored it and focused on cleaning the counters. But as I reached to grab a towel, I heard that faint tapping again. 3 steady knocks. Then silence. It came from behind the freezer wall this time. I froze and waited. Another 3 knocks, slower. I felt my chest tighten. I told myself it was metal expanding from the cold, but it sounded too deliberate. I went back to wiping, moving faster now. But the knocks kept coming, not loud, just steady, almost like someone was testing the wall. After a few minutes, the sound stopped completely. I finished the last few tasks and walked to the front, ready to leave. I checked the doors, turned off the lights, and was about to set the alarm when I remembered I hadn't turned off the freezer light. I didn't want Rob to find out I'd missed it, so I went back. The hallway leading to the kitchen felt colder. The hum was still there, low and constant. When I turned the corner, I saw the light spilling from the freezer door. It was open a few inches. I froze. I knew I'd shut it earlier. I walked slowly toward it, the rubber soles of my shoes sticking slightly with each step. The air coming from inside was freezing, biting at my hands. I grabbed the handle to close it, but before I could, something faint brushed against the inside wall. Not a noise this time, a vibration, like someone lightly dragging their fingers along the metal from the other side. I could feel it through the door. The sound moved slowly from left to right, then stopped directly where my hand rested. I stepped back fast, heart racing. I waited, staring at the door, expecting another sound. None came. I forced myself to push the door closed and heard the latch click. I turned to leave, and that's when I noticed the storage room door across the hallway. It was open too. That door was always locked. I hesitated, staring into the dark room. The light inside was dim, just a single yellow bulb hanging low. The hum was louder in there, pulsing in a slow rhythm. I took one step, closer, and felt the temperature drop sharply. My breath came out in white clouds. The air smelled metallic, like rust and something faintly sour. The shelves were covered in dust, and the floor had marks on it. Thin, curved streaks that looked like something had been dragged repeatedly. They led toward the back wall, where a large metal panel sat slightly ajar. Behind it was complete darkness. I don't know why I did it, but I took another step forward. The hum seemed to get louder, more uneven, like it was reacting to me. Then came a faint scraping sound from behind that panel, slow and deliberate, like something moving close to the surface. I felt a cold pulse run through my legs. That's when I turned and ran. I didn't even bother locking the back door. I just grabbed my bag, set the alarm, and left through the front. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before starting my car. From the parking lot, I could still hear the hum through the walls, steady and low, like it was following me out. I didn't tell anyone the next day what happened. When I showed up for my shift, everything looked normal. The freezer was closed, the storage room door was shut, and Rob didn't mention anything strange. I kept wondering if maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I'd just been too tired. But when I went into the kitchen, I noticed something new. The floor in front of the storage room door had a faint damp mark, a thin, dark outline that curved slightly, like someone had traced something heavy along the tiles. No one else seemed to notice it. I kept catching myself staring at the spot during prep, but nobody mentioned a thing. That night, I worked the closing shift again, but Rob stayed late this time. I felt better knowing I wasn't alone. When midnight came, we started our usual routine, wiping down the tables, running the dishwasher, and restocking the sauces. The hum behind the freezer was quieter than before, almost gone. For a while, it felt normal again. Then around 12:40, the power flickered. Just a quick blink, enough to make the lights buzz. Rob swore softly, checked the circuit panel, and said it was fine. But after that flicker, I noticed the hum had changed. It wasn't steady anymore. It came in uneven bursts, almost like breathing. Long pause, short hum, long hum, pause. I tried to ignore it, but it started matching the rhythm of my own breathing until I couldn't tell if it was in my head or not. When I finished wiping the kitchen counters, Rob said he'd step outside for a smoke. I nodded and went to refill the ice bins. The hum got louder as soon as he left. It pulsed in short bursts now, deep and low. I looked toward the freezer and saw that the metal panel in the storage room, the one I'd seen open, was now rattling slightly. Not shaking, just moving enough to make a faint metallic tap every few seconds. I walked slowly toward it, listening carefully. The air was freezing again, even though the freezer door was closed. My skin prickled. When I reached the doorway, the light above flickered twice, and I saw condensation rolling down the inside of the metal panel like sweat. The hum grew sharper. Then came the tapping again, 3 times, soft and slow. I whispered Rob's name before realizing how useless it was. My voice sounded strange, hollow in the narrow space. I waited for him to come back, but instead the tapping shifted to the other side of the panel, higher up, closer to my ear level. I could hear it clearer now, the light drag of nails, or something like nails, scraping along the inside. The bulb above me buzzed loudly, flickered once more, and went out completely. The hum stopped too. It was dead silent for about 5 seconds, long enough that I could hear my heartbeat. Then, from inside the wall came a sound that made every part of me lock up. It was a single, slow breath, drawn in deep, like someone inhaling just inches from the surface. I stumbled backward and nearly slipped. I didn't look back. I ran straight through the kitchen toward the front. As I passed the freezer, I felt a heavy vibration through the floor that made the shelves rattle. The light above the counter flickered again, and in that half second of brightness, I saw a long smear across the freezer door. A faint streak that looked like something had been dragged downward, leaving a wide, wet mark. When Rob came back inside, I was already standing outside in the parking lot, shaking. He looked confused until I told him something was wrong with the freezer wall. He went to check. But when he opened the storage room, everything was quiet. The light worked again, the panel wasn't moving, and the hum was steady like normal. He told me to go home and get some sleep. I didn't argue. The next day, Rob called everyone in early. He said maintenance had found a leak behind the freezer wall, something with the foundation. He said the wall had a hollow section that wasn't supposed to be there, like someone had built over an old access space. They sealed it with concrete and replaced the wiring. For a while, everything went back to normal. But about a month later, Rob quit suddenly. He didn't give a reason, just said he couldn't stay in the building anymore. The steakhouse closed 3 months after that. The new owners remodeled it into a sports bar. I drove by once when they were still working on it and saw they'd torn out the entire freezer area. Still, every time I drive past at night, I swear I can hear that low hum when I roll down my window. Steady, patient, deep enough to feel in my chest. And sometimes, when it's really quiet, I can almost make out those 3 soft taps that used to come after. Story 6. There was a pizza restaurant I worked at for about a year when I was 19. It was a small, family-owned place. Nothing fancy. Just a few booths and a long counter where people could watch the pizzas being made. The ovens were old, big brick ones that took hours to heat up, and the whole kitchen smelled like yeast and smoke. I worked nights mostly, helping with closing. The owner, Tony, was one of those people who treated his restaurant like a second home. He lived nearby and came in every day, even on holidays. The building itself was older than it looked. The restaurant used to be a butcher shop decades before Tony bought it. You could tell by the uneven floor tiles and the heavy iron hooks still embedded in one of the back walls. Tony kept them there because he said they were part of the building's history. I always thought they made the place feel strange, like something from a different time that hadn't fully left. The weird thing started with the smell. At first, I didn't think anything of it because kitchens always smell like something. But this was different. It came late at night, around the same time every shift after the ovens were off. It wasn't food. It was a sour, heavy smell like damp rags or old meat left in a cooler too long. I'd checked the drains, the trash, the fridge. Everything was clean. Tony said it was probably from the pipes. Then the noises started. Not loud, but steady. Knocking, faint and uneven, coming from under the oven floor. Sometimes it sounded like tapping metal, other times like dull thuds, slow and spaced out. Everyone heard it eventually, even the cooks. Tony told us not to worry about it, said the ovens expanded when cooling down. But one night, the sound started before we'd even turned them off. It was around 10:30 p.m. The last customers had just left. I was sweeping near the prep counter when I heard 3 soft knocks from behind me. I looked over at the ovens. Nothing. I thought maybe someone had dropped something in the back, so I ignored it. Then it came again, but this time it sounded closer, like it came from right beneath my feet. The kitchen floor had these large square tiles that always felt warm from the oven heat. That night, though, the tile under me felt colder. I crouched down and touched it. It wasn't just cold. It was damp. I pressed my hand flat, and it made a faint squishing sound like moisture trapped beneath it. I stood up fast and called Tony over. He checked it out, shrugged, and said it was condensation from the oven base. But his face looked uneasy. After that night, I started noticing small puddles forming in that same spot after closing. Just little ones, not enough to mop, but enough to notice. The water didn't smell like anything, and it was always gone by morning. We kept working like normal, but I started hearing faint dripping when the ovens cooled. Not from above, but from underneath. One Friday, I had to close alone because Tony went home early for a family thing. I didn't mind. It was quiet, and I liked cleaning in peace. Around midnight, I was wiping down the counters when I heard the knocking again. 3 short taps, then 2 slower ones. It didn't sound random anymore. It sounded like a pattern. I set the rag down and listened. The sound came again from under the same tile. I felt my stomach twist. I leaned down and tapped the floor with my knuckle once. The sound stopped. I waited. About 5 seconds later, 2 knocks came back, like something responding. I froze. My hand started to shake. I told myself I was just imagining it, that the echo from my knock bounced off something metal. I packed up as fast as I could. But as I turned off the last light, I heard it again. 3 knocks this time, then a pause, then 1 long scrape, like something dragging against the concrete below. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I told Tony what happened. He just looked tired and said the restaurant had quirks. Then he said something that stuck with me. He said the place had been remodeled 3 times, but no matter what they did, that section of floor was always colder than the rest. He laughed like it was a joke, but his eyes didn't. A week later, the oven nearest that spot started acting up. It made strange popping noises, and one night it shut off completely. When the repairman came, he had to pull up part of the tile to reach the gas line. That's when things got worse. When the repairman lifted the tile, the smell hit first. It was strong, heavy, and sour, like rotted meat mixed with damp soil. Everyone stepped back. Tony came out from the office with a rag over his nose, and even he looked pale. The space under the tile wasn't deep, maybe a foot or 2, but it wasn't what anyone expected. The concrete below was darker than the rest, and the dirt under it was wet, too wet for an indoor foundation. The repairman said the moisture shouldn't even be possible, since there were no pipes in that section. He started scraping the dirt with his tool to find the gas line, and after a few seconds, the tool hit something hard. It didn't sound like metal or stone. It made a dull thump, like hitting old wood. He cleared more of the dirt and froze. Then he stood up, quietly packed his tools, and said he couldn't work there anymore. He didn't explain, just left. Tony looked into the hole for a long time before covering it with a sheet of plywood. He told everyone to avoid that area and that he'd take care of it himself the next day. Nobody asked questions. But that night, the smell got worse. I could smell it from the dining room, thick and sharp, like it was seeping through the air vents. The next morning, the plywood was gone and the tile was back in place. Tony said he fixed the problem. The smell disappeared for a few days, but the knocking didn't. It came back softer, slower, and more random. Sometimes during lunch rush, I'd hear it faintly under the noise of people talking, and I'd look down without meaning to. The tile always looked the same, slightly darker, slightly uneven. One night, about a week later, I was closing alone again. The air felt heavy, humid, like the ovens were leaking heat even though they were off. I was mopping near that same spot, trying not to look down. When the mop passed over it, the handle vibrated slightly, like the floor underneath had moved. I stopped and leaned down. The tile was warm now, almost hot to the touch. Then I heard a faint sound. Not the knocking this time, but something softer, wet and slow, like someone dragging their hand along the underside of the floor. It went in one direction, stopped, and came back. The mop handle shook again, and the bucket beside me started to rattle gently on the floor. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, but I didn't run. I wanted to understand what I was hearing, even though every instinct told me to leave. The sound grew clearer. It wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate. A long drag, a pause, and 3 short taps. Then again, drag, pause, 3 taps. I stepped back farther, and the floor under that tile shifted slightly, just enough to make a faint crack in the grout. The lights flickered overhead, and for a moment I could see steam rising faintly from the tile, like heat escaping. The smell came back too, strong enough to make my eyes water. I ran out and waited by the door until Tony arrived. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. I told him what I'd heard, and he just stood there, quiet. Then he said in a flat voice that sometimes the building remembered things. I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't want to ask. He told me to go home and take the rest of the week off. When I came back the following Monday, the tile was gone again. In its place was a metal plate bolted into the floor. Tony said it was to stop moisture from getting through. I noticed his hands were wrapped in bandages. He didn't explain that either. The restaurant stayed open for another few months before shutting down for renovations. I drove past it once during the remodel. The windows were boarded up, and there was a faint orange glow flickering inside like a welding light or a fire. A few weeks later, I read online that the place never reopened. Tony had sold it to another family, but they backed out before ever moving in. Now, the building is empty. People say it's condemned because of bad plumbing and unstable foundation. But every time I pass by on my way home, I roll the window down just a little. And in the quiet, I can still hear those 3 soft knocks, spaced perfectly apart, coming from deep under the ground. Story 7. There was a seafood restaurant I used to work at right off the coast. It was small but busy, the kind of place that always smelled like salt water and frying oil. The building sat on wooden stilts over the edge of the pier, and when the tide came in, you could hear the waves hitting the beams underneath. During the day, it was peaceful, but when the sun went down and the wind picked up, the sound changed. It stopped sounding like waves and started sounding like something knocking from below. I worked the late shift most nights, helping close and restock the freezers. The walk-in cooler was at the far end of the kitchen, right by the back door that opened to the dock. That door always stuck in the humidity, and sometimes it wouldn't close all the way unless you kicked it. The boards outside creaked under your weight, and when the wind blew, you could hear the ocean right beneath your feet. The first strange thing happened on a Tuesday. It was late, close to midnight, and the place was empty except for me and the line cook, Mark. We were cleaning up when we heard something heavy move below us. It sounded like a crate sliding across wood, slow and scraping. We both froze, thinking maybe someone was out on the dock. Mark went to check, but the dock was empty. The boards were wet, and the tide was high, but there was no one out there. After that, we started hearing things more often. The sounds always came late, heavy dragging, dull knocks, or sometimes a single, deep thud from underneath. Tony, the owner, said it was just the current pushing debris against the beams. That made sense, but it didn't explain why the knocks sounded so regular. Always 3 at a time, always the same distance apart. One night, I had to close by myself. Mark had gone home sick, and Tony had already left. It was raining hard outside, the kind of rain that made the whole place shake with the wind. Around 11:30, I started mopping the back kitchen. The air smelled thick with salt, and the lights kept flickering from the storm. When I got near the cooler, I noticed something strange. The floorboards under me were damp, even though the roof didn't leak there. I knelt down and touched the wood. It felt soft, swollen, like it had been wet for a long time. Then I heard the knocking again. 3 deep thuds, slower this time. They came from directly under where I was standing. I froze, hands still on the floor. Another 3 knocks followed, closer, heavy enough that I felt them in my knees. The sound didn't echo like before. It felt like it was right below the boards. I stood up fast and grabbed my phone for the flashlight. I aimed it at the floor, even though I didn't know what I expected to see. The light reflected off the damp wood, and for a second I thought I saw it move. Just slightly, like something pushing upward. The light flickered from my shaky hand, and when I looked again, it was still. The rain hit harder against the windows, and I could hear the tide rising below. I went to check the dock, thinking maybe the water had lifted something against the beams. When I opened the back door, the smell of the ocean rushed in, cold, sharp, and foul. The dock was half flooded, the waves slapping against the stilts below. I crouched to look between the gaps in the boards, shining my light down. The water was dark, swirling from the current, but I saw movement under there. Not debris, not seaweed. Something pale. It looked like an arm, or maybe just a piece of rope, floating just below the surface, rolling slowly with the waves. I leaned forward for a better look, but the wind pushed the door hard against me, and I almost lost my balance. When I looked again, whatever it was gone. I went back inside, soaked and shaking. The smell of the ocean was stronger now, mixed with something else, like spoiled fish left out too long. I mopped the floor again, but the wet spot near the cooler wouldn't dry. It just kept spreading. I could see small bubbles rising through the cracks between the boards, slow and steady, like the floor itself was breathing. I didn't stay long after that. I shut off the lights, locked the front, and left the mop where it was. When I stepped outside, I could still hear the knocking, faint but steady, coming from under the building. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. The sound followed me halfway across the parking lot, until the wind and rain drowned it out. The next morning, Tony called me before my shift. He sounded off like he hadn't slept. He said the dock had flooded overnight and that one of the beams under the kitchen had collapsed slightly. He told me not to come in until repairs were done. I asked if anyone checked under the building, and he just said the tide would go down soon and hung up. 2 days later, I went back to help move supplies into storage while they worked on the repairs. The floor in the back kitchen had been torn up, planks stacked in a corner, and the boards underneath were darker than they should have been. The smell hit me again the second I stepped in. Salt, rot, and something faintly sweet, like decaying seaweed. The workers said the wood had water damage all the way through. When they pulled up one of the beams, the guy holding the crowbar stopped and stepped back fast. He said something moved down there. Tony told him it was just a crab or maybe a fish caught in the boards, but when we all leaned over to look, it didn't look like any fish. It was a shape, small, pale, curled tight against the beam. The worker poked it with the crowbar, and it just sank deeper into the water. He refused to touch it again. After they left for the day, Tony asked me to help clean up the mess around the floor. I didn't want to, but he looked exhausted and anxious, so I stayed. We worked in silence, stacking broken boards and wiping what we could. The air was so damp that the walls near the cooler were covered in condensation. Around 8 p.m., when the sun was gone and only the kitchen lights were on, the knocking started again. It came from underneath, slower this time, but loud enough that both of us heard it clearly. Tony stopped what he was doing and stared at the hole in the floor. The water below rippled, even though the tide wasn't high. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. The same rhythm I'd heard before. Tony whispered something in Italian under his breath and grabbed a hammer from the counter. He knelt down and hit the beam hard once. The sound stopped instantly. The water went still. He stayed crouched like that for a while, watching. Then, after maybe 10 seconds, there was another sound. Lighter this time, almost like fingertips brushing the wood from underneath. It moved slowly along the beam, traveling toward the edge where the boards hadn't been replaced yet. I stepped back without meaning to. The air felt colder, heavy with moisture. Tony didn't move. He just kept staring at the floor. Then, right before my eyes, the water shifted again. Something pale floated up from the dark space between the stilts. Not a full shape, just part of one. White and smooth, like a hand rising briefly before the tide took it down again. I turned away fast and told Tony we should leave. He didn't argue. The next morning, the restaurant was closed off with caution tape. They said the beams were unsafe and that the building would have to be torn down. But it wasn't torn down. It just sat there for months, half sinking, with boards missing and the windows fogged over. I heard from another worker later that the repair crew refused to go under it. They said the smell was too bad and that every time the tide came in, they heard the knocking too. Last year I went back out there. The restaurant's still standing, barely. The windows are gone. The deck's collapsed on one side, and the water moves right under what's left of the kitchen. The air still smells faintly of salt and rot, and when the wind dies down, you can hear something tapping under the boards. Slow, careful, almost polite. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Sometimes when the tide pulls back, you can see pale shapes beneath the beams, too smooth to be driftwood, too still to be alive. I didn't stay long enough to watch what happened when the water covered them again.